All right, guys, well, welcome to Unit C, Environmental Chemistry. And we're going to be looking at many different cycles and many different things that you're going to need to understand for the years to come in chemistry and in biology. So you can take a look at those cartoons there. We're going to be talking about the nitrogen cycle in a sec. So what is environmental chemistry and why is it important to us? We need to understand what is environmental chemistry, how do natural processes change chemistry of the environment, how do human-made chemicals get into the environment, things like pesticides and stuff like that, and how do such chemicals affect the living organisms that are around us. So the deal is that we're going to really be focusing in on a few things that are important, and you're actually going to see them in grade 10, 11, and 12. And one of the things that we're going to look at first is something called the nitrogen cycle. And the nitrogen cycle has to do with the amount of nitrogen that's in the air and how it becomes usable to us humans. This is a really important biological and environmental concept that we need to kind of understand. We're going to look at other things like pesticides, garbage juice, fossil fuels that go into the environment and burn up the environment. So we need to understand those processes too, what types of gases are being released and what can we do about it. So here's the deal, you guys. We learned in grade 7 these two really important processes that are going to haunt you for life. And those two are photosynthesis and chemical respiration. The deal is that photosynthesis is able to take in, they need CO2 and they need H2O to produce sugar, and then they also produce oxygen that we breathe. And so the deal is that what plants take in is carbon dioxide. They drink that in, and they need to drink in water as well to grow. They make energy, which is what we eat in salads, but they also make oxygen. And that oxygen comes back to us in a cycle called cellular respiration, because we actually breathe the oxygen that the plants give us, and we are able then to be able to produce energy, and we're able to do all those processes that are important for our lives. So those are important chemicals, and those are important processes in our environment. So some natural chemicals, some harmful chemicals are produced by nature. So you need to understand that all gases are not safe. So right here we have a forest fire, and the forest fire is producing at this time a lot of gases. So forest fires produce high concentrations of CO2. Carbon dioxide gas is one of the leading causes for global warming. It is a massive byproduct that we need to try to mediate in our world. The next thing that we see there natural is volcanoes, and volcanoes actually produce poisonous gases like carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and hydrogen sulfide. All really bad things. In fact, when volcanoes blow up, it affects the entire atmosphere, not just the place that it blows up, but even our own atmosphere here. It will begin to pollute the world with different types of gases. We have to be really careful with that, and we have to watch that. Plants make photochemicals to help them survive and ward off predators. What's interesting is some plants are able to actually produce things inside of them to be able to keep them safe. So we have to understand that producing chemicals is something that the natural elements do all the time. It's what we as humans do with that and how we understand that helps us move forward in the chemical world. Some chemicals are harmful to life that are produced by humans. Well, obviously you know this. So obviously you see some of the industry there. Burning fossil fuels, massive thing we're going to be talking about. You have to understand that CO2 is an extremely dangerous gas that goes into the atmosphere, and it affects our temperature on Earth. It affects how we live. Sulfur dioxide, nitrogen monoxide, and O3, which is ozone, is super bad, and it creates an imbalance which actually creates kind of this climate change that happens, and that's the stuff that a lot of people have been talking about in the news prior to all the stuff that's going down right now. We have some other processes there. Extracting and producing oil and gases uses fossil fuels to get more. So Alberta uses a lot of fossil fuels. This is a really big deal here, is that potentially we could be producing a lot of byproducts that could be dangerous to the environment. Waste products from processing oil and gas create toxic lakes, tailing ponds, and have naphthopathic acids. So just super bad acids whenever we're kind of doing that. We'll look at that a little bit later. Another thing that we have to be really mindful about is this thing called heavy metals. And this isn't something that we are going to look at right now, but when we talk about heavy metals, you can see there in the picture that there's battery acid. Heavy metals in batteries are toxic such as mercury and lead. You guys, there's a massive deal that happened in Japan with massive amounts of mercury poisoning. In fact, it created mutations in babies, and we'll start to look at that later. But the deal is that heavy metals, things that are actually on the periodic table that are metals, can be super dangerous to humans if we ingest them in any way, shape, or form. And those metals can actually get into the environment, into the rivers, into oceans, and we need to be able to be careful with that stuff. So those are dangerous things that man-made, that we can make them or we use them in our products, throw them into a landfill, and then they leach into the atmosphere, and that's not good. So the next thing that is important for us to understand is nitrogen. And nitrogen is a huge piece of the air that we breathe. If you're taking a look at the chart right now, you can see that nitrogen makes up 78% of the air. This is something that you're going to have to understand next year and the year after. The deal is that nitrogen is in the oxygen that we breathe, but nitrogen is actually unusable in its form, right, just like naturally in the air. So nitrogen has to be fixed, we call it. Not fixed like you fix your puppy or anything like that, but it actually just has to be created to be able to attach to things to be usable. Nitrogen in its form, just N2, it comes like that in the atmosphere. It needs to be fixed to be able to do things inside of plants. It needs to be fixed to be able to be usable in our world. So how is usable nitrogen created? So what's really interesting is that a natural process like lightning, this is super crazy, is that it actually splits the N2, the nitrogen, and it creates free nitrogen ions, just N's. See, nitrogen in the atmosphere comes in N2, but actually we want to free it into just being an N. Bacteria in plant root actually fixes nitrogen to be usable by plants. And so there's this bacteria in the roots that actually fixes the nitrogen in the air and allows plants to use that nitrogen to grow. Nitrogen fixation is important because nitrogen in the air is unusable until things like lightning and things like plant roots actually combine together to make those elements useful in our bodies or useful in the plants or useful in the atmosphere. So why is nitrogen important? This is something that you're going to look at in grade 10 science, relatively briefly, but also comes back to you if you do biology in grade 11. Nitrogen is part of a plant's chlorophyll and proteins. So nitrogen is important in plants. In fact, you find it in fertilizers, which we'll look in a second. A plant can only use nitrogen that's been fixed. So nitrogen that's been either fixed by the roots or fixed by that lightning, because if you don't fix that nitrogen, you just can't use it. So fixed nitrogen combined with other elements such as hydrogen and oxygen get fixed, and then actually it creates this cycle. The nitrogen cycle has to do with how the nitrogen moves from the air down into the soil, all the way down to the depths of the soil, and then how it comes back out of the soil and gets used again in the atmosphere, and it keeps cycling. An important cycle for you to understand. If you take a look at there, when the nitrogen is in the air, it's actually fixed by the lightning bolt there, which means that it's being able to be used now as nitrogen. When it gets into the soil, there's nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and that nitrogen-fixing bacteria allows plants to grow because it needs nitrogen, but you can't just use nitrogen in the air, you have to fix it. So NH3 and nitrifying bacteria actually create these different types of ammonias that allow plants to grow really, really well. Nitrification happens, but then after all the nitrogen is used in the soil, there's a denitrification process that happens, which basically just means that the nitrogen goes back to being into the atmosphere and it needs to be fixed again to be used again by the plants. Other things that produce nitrogen for us are things like cows. Cows poo on the ground, and any waste or pee that they have actually goes into the soil as fixed and usable nitrogen and helps plants grow. This is why we spray manure all over the place and make plants grow. And so basically you need to understand that that when the plants are eaten by animals, then they're able to fix that nitrogen and poop it out, and actually it makes plants grow a lot better too, which is kind of crazy. So nitrogen is in the air, in the soil, and in the water. So there's this thing called the Haber-Bosch, and it's a process of using nitrogen to create fertilizers. So nitrogen is in fertilizers, you need to know that. And this adds nitrogen to the nitrogen cycle. Burning biomass, which is like burning wood or leaves, also releases nitrogen into the atmosphere. So if we take a look at this diagram, we can see that nitrogen needs to be fixed for plants to grow, as you see there. So that's why we put that nice little fertilizer in the soil, and that helps the plants grow. And then there's all of these things happening. Some of the nitrogen goes into the ocean, and then basically the nitrogen goes back into the atmosphere. Nitrogen is cycling all over the earth, into the water cycle, into the soil all the time. And so it's just important for you to understand that it's all there. Here's the deal. Humans affect the environment. Humans release chemicals into the air, into the water and soil every day. Some chemicals are broken down by natural processes and others can't be broken down at all. This alters the concentration of certain substances in nature and can have a harmful impact called pollution. So you guys, here is all of the pieces that pollution adds, and this is basically what this unit is all about, is how are these dangerous gases that we've read about affecting our world. So basically, here's the deal. We look at growing crops and altering land, releases nutrients from the soil. It adds fertilizers and pest controls. You guys, when we farm land, we need to use pesticides, which are chemicals that we made, which can affect the environment. When we farm land, when we put chemicals on that soil, it actually can leach into the water, and I'll show you what happened. We'll create algae blooms. So that's super not great all the time, so we have to be able to mediate that. We have a wastewater treatment plant, and treating wastewater and releasing it back into the rivers. And so we have to be able to take out the harmful things and be able to put it back in, but that involves chemical use as well. We need to be able to dispose of solid waste. So even like our diapers and stuff that we use to change our babies and stuff go into the landfills. And so we have to be able to be careful that all of that baby juice from the diaper doesn't seep into the soil and affect what's going on in the environment around them. Manufacturing produces tons of gas. You've seen it all the time. You've seen those big smokestacks and stuff like that, and it releases gas into the atmosphere, and that is manufacturing. We have to make goods, but when we make goods, we make gases. Transportation is a huge one, which is why they don't want us to drive our cars around, or why they're making hybrid cars so that it doesn't take as much gas and it takes some electricity. We don't want to release harmful chemicals into the atmosphere. And factories, like we said, in manufacturing, produce tons of gas into the atmosphere, which again affects global warming, which again can affect really just how our atmosphere is responding. So you need to understand that pollution, any change in the environment caused by a human activity, is harmful to life. So what are some ways that we pollute stuff? Well, if we take a look at all these pictures, we can see that there's tons of ways that we are polluting the environment every day. Obviously, we look at things like plastic bags, or we look at things like stuff that doesn't biodegrade. We're trying to move away from those things and lessen our carbon footprint. We're looking at gases that are releasing into the atmosphere from factories. We're looking at water that goes back into the lake. If you go for a bike ride or for a walk by the river valley, you'll notice that there's all these crazy things that release water back into the atmosphere, to the North Saskatchewan River. Is that water safe or isn't it? Where is it coming from? We're driving our cars every day, we're releasing gases, and so on and on it goes. We pollute the environment. So we need to focus on a few things today so that you'll know how to do your project in this unit. And the first thing is agricultural activities. So farmers have to be good chemists to produce good crops. They observe plant growth and make adjustments based on what plants need. You guys, plants need fertilizer to help them grow. We want to be able to produce the best crops so that we can make A, the most money, and B, we can feed our populations. But they're going to have to be able to figure that out and weigh that out with the environment. So fertilizers, plants tell us what they need. Fertilizers are chemicals that humans add into the environment, but they add nutrients into the soil, and they can be compost or synthetic or stuff like that. So examples of plants lacking certain elements. So there you go. If you ever wanted to know what a healthy plant looks like and what other potassium deficit, nitrogen deficit. Actually, these three things are in fertilizers, the nitrogen, potassium, and phosphate. And so you can actually take a look at leaves if you are going to be like a botanist type person and figure out what they need. So this is what fertilizers do. There's always NPK in fertilizers, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. And how much of that, when you go to the store with your parents and you're going to do some gardening right now, they actually have the NPK on all bags of fertilizer. And so guys, this is what it is. Nitrogen helps with leaf development. So if you have plants that you want leaves to grow, you want a high nitrogen content. It makes your lawn green. So we're going to put nitrogen into our lawn to make it green. Phosphorus aids in root growth. So if you want your plants to be stable, to be able to be there for a long time, you want some root growth. And potassium is vital for disease resistance and root development. So sometimes in areas where maybe the climate's a little harsher and maybe there's different bugs or different things that are going on, you want more potassium. Numbers on the bag are percentages. For example, 16-4-8 is 16% nitrogen, 4% phosphorus, and 8% potassium. So guys, this is a big one. Too much fertilizer, what does it do? Too much fertilizer can actually harm plants and wash into lakes, ponds, and streams, damaging aqua ecosystems. So if you get too much nitrogen in your fertilizer, it attracts insects, which we don't like, and lots of diseases. It makes things grow quick, making stems weak, and plants end up falling over. If you get too much potassium, the plants grow too poorly, they can't absorb zinc, and if you get too much potassium, it blocks other nutrients from being absorbed. Something that we talk about lots in class when we were here is algae blooms. Too much fertilizer can actually cause excessive plant growth in local lakes, streams, and rivers and oceans. Algae blooms are something that is mostly human caused because of fertilizer. Algae blooms are dense layers of tiny, thick green plants that occur on the surface of lakes and other bodies of water where there's an overabundance of nutrients, primarily phosphorus from fertilizer, on which algae depends. This effect is called eutrophication. You guys, this happens in our Alberta lakes. It's part of the reasons why our Alberta lakes are sort of gross and disgusting to go swimming in. So phosphorus and nitrogen from fertilizers can make their way into lakes and streams after a large rainstorm, and they can run off in pipes. So if you look at the picture there, that is actually the ocean. And if you are going to fertilize your lawn, or if a lot of people are fertilizing their golf courses and all this stuff, it actually, when it rains, it dissolves all of that fertilizer, and it runs off into the river and creates this massive algae bloom. Taking a look at the picture next to it, it says that plants need oxygen to live, but so do other animals and fish. When you get all that green gunk inside of your lakes or inside of your ponds or even inside of the ocean, all the fish cannot breathe because the plants are taking all the oxygen. So all the fish die off because they have no oxygen to breathe because all of that algae is taking it away from them. It's important to not over-fertilize your fields and your bodies of water because when it rains, it can leach into that system, which is why even in Edmonton, we have to be careful because we have a lot of golf courses along our river valley, and we have to be careful to not over-fertilize so that it doesn't run into our rivers. The next thing that's important to understand about chemicals in the environment is that we use pesticides and or herbicides. So insecticides are made to kill organisms that harm crops. So lots of insecticides, or we call those pesticides. Same thing, pests, insects, interchangeable word. Herbicides are made to kill weeds that compete with unwanted plants. So there you have a whole bunch of Roundup and stuff. And fungicides kill mushrooms and stuff that destroy wanted plants. So why do we use pesticides? Pesticides are harmful chemicals to kill certain living organisms, and they can bioaccumulate in the environment and harm other species and other humans. You guys, pesticides are sprayed on everything that we eat. If you're not buying everything organic, you're eating pesticides, which is why your parents tell you to wash your vegetables really, really, really well when you get them in the house, because we spray stuff so that the pests don't eat them all the time. The word bioaccumulate, we'll look at that in a second, means that we start to put chemicals on the ground, on the very initial piece that we start to eat, which is our vegetables and our food and our grass. Everything that we know eats that. Bunny rabbits, we know that, but what eats bunny rabbits is maybe a fox, and what eats foxes is maybe a bear. And it starts to accumulate in all of the different animals up the food chain. So it eventually gets to me or to you. It gets to us, bioaccumulation. People eat foods sprayed in these chemicals which can harm our own health, which is why a lot of people buy organic, or why we really want to make sure that we wash our vegetables really well so that it doesn't have pesticides on it and we don't get that. 50% of the world's food production would be lost to pests without pesticides. I mean, guys, we have to use pesticides because think about all of the bugs that are wanting to eat our food. Pesticides often kill organisms that are wanted, such as bees. So actually what's happening, and sometimes what they find, is they'll put things like Roundup or different stuff into their spray the wheat fields, and they'll spray the wheat fields, and the bumblebees will come, and sometimes we accidentally create a pesticide that when the bees land and try to pollinate, they actually get that pesticide inside of them, and they have found that entire bee colonies haven't made it back to their hive because they've all died because of pesticides. Some last in the environment for many years, and they basically harm us for a long, long time, which is what we'll look at in a second. I want to look at something called DDT, and DDT is one of the most harmful chemicals that was produced that the world thought, especially in North America, thought, man, this is what we need to do. This is what's going to change our lives. DDT was getting rid of mosquitoes. It was getting rid of so many different types of pests, and they sprayed it everywhere, on people, everywhere. It was crazy. DDT was actually created in 1874, so it's a massive pesticide that was created a long time ago and was used up into the 1900s, or the early 1900s. And so it was an annoying pest, and so trying to kill mozzies, so mosquitoes. There was actually the first time there was a female scientist named Rachel Carson. A female scientist questioned the logic of broadcasting potentially dangerous chemicals into the environment with little or prior investigation. They really didn't do very much research on this and their health effects. DDT and other pesticides have been shown to cause cancer, that their agricultural use was a threat to wildlife, particularly to birds. And so actually what's starting to happen is as this chemical is being used for year after year after year, more and more animals were starting to die. And in those animals we found DDT. And we're talking like lots of years, hundreds of years later really. And finally this lady said, guys, we got to stop using this because eventually it's going to get into us. She was right and proved right, and they eventually said no more DDT. The reality was that as DDT was building up in the environment, more and more animals were found with this toxic pesticide, and eventually humans would eat these animals, and it would have been stuck around today. They still do find traces of DDT in certain animals today, and that was a long time ago. If you notice in the picture, one of them is a bunch of kids on a swimming pool, and they're actually spraying DDT right into their faces because they believe that it would take away pests. Kind of crazy. DDT and biomagnification. The word biomagnification is important to know for biology, and that's going to be an important word that you're going to have to understand from now all the way into grade 10 through to grade 12. Basically, biomagnification is a process that occurs when a certain toxic chemical, just like DDT, starts to build up in the environment. And it goes up the food chain by working their way through the environment into the soil or into the water system. And so as you see there on the diagram, you'll see that there's just a tiny bit of DDT in the water, just one part or whatever, right? And so the producers are the things that eat the algae, and they get a little bit, and it starts to get more and more. So 1,000 zooplankton eats the producers, so they get 10,000. Small fish start to eat it, so it's in their body system, 100,000. Then we get to large fish. They start eating the small fish and the zooplankton and the producers, and they're in the water, so they get 1 million parts of that DDT inside of them. And then eventually that bird comes down, eats the fish, and look at how much DDT is concentrated. That's biomagnification. This can eventually cause really bad health effects or death. I want to just take a look at some pictures of the current locust swarm that's happening in Africa right now, as well as through some of the Asian countries. These locusts it's one of the worst swarms, and they are millions of them. If you look at the picture in the bottom right, you'll see the man running through the field, millions and millions and millions. In fact, there's going to be more through the summer because they continue to reproduce. This man has to use pesticides to save any crop, and to be honest, it's going to eat a ton of the food down there in that different part of the world. So pretty insane. We got to use pesticides at some point, but we've got to be careful. The next type of waste that we're going to look at is solid waste. So garbage collected from your household or industry plants or commercial buildings. And we just want to talk just really briefly about the things you know about. So obviously we recycle stuff. Obviously in other countries, not in our country, they actually burn their garbage. Why? Because there's no space. I mean, in China, they have millions of people living everywhere. Or maybe in India as well. They incarcerate their garbage. But when you burn things, you produce CO2 in the atmosphere. So basically, it can be a really, really bad cycle, and it can get out of hand really quickly. But it does create a lot of pollution in the air when we burn things. Sanitary landfills are what we use here in Alberta, as well as in Canada, because we have a lot of space. We can dig up a hole and pour garbage in there all the time. But sanitary landfills are different than just normal landfills. And so let's just take a look at that. You need to understand that when you take a look at this picture, that what you'll see is there's actually a liner, a very, really thick plastic liner that is there, so that all that gross, disgusting garbage juice from your batteries and all of your kids' diapers, as they get squished out, think about all that garbage juice that's being squished out, they want to basically protect that from getting into our water table, which is below the groundwater that we drink. And so basically they have these little pipelines, if you'll notice, and so these little pipelines down here called leachette pipes, and they actually pump that garbage juice into a special like lake or a pool where they dispose of it correctly, because if they just had all that garbage juice just sitting around, it would get into this water and we would be drinking diaper juice, I guess. So that is a sanitary landfill, having that really nice liner. You'll notice here that there's topsoil, sand, clay, and they just have a whole bunch of different layers to be able to protect us. Leachette is garbage juice. That's just a fancy word for garbage juice, so leachette. Landfills are carefully designed so that toxins don't escape and get into the surrounding soil. And so we just said that leachette is the liquid that passes through a landfill, and it can leach into the ground. And so it can be really, really dangerous. We want to get rid of it. We want to talk about wastewater, like sewage treatment. So sewage is any undissolved material from your kitchen, your bathroom, and your laundry. It moves through the pipes to be treated and released. It's not always treated properly, and it can damage rivers and lakes. When you think about places that don't have a lot of money, and I'm talking about nations that don't have a lot of money, their wastewater treatment is a lot different than ours is. Ours is very high, but some are very good, and they just pour everything back into their rivers. So septic tanks in rural areas, they have these septic tanks that break down organic waste before going back into the soil. We have sewage treatment plant. We have a great one here. Wastewater goes into urban areas and we treat it. And the treated water is called effluents, and we put it back into the North Saskatchewan River. We drink the North Saskatchewan River, guys, so we have to be able to put the treated water. So the water that comes from your bathtub, so when you have a shower, from your kitchen sink, all goes to the wastewater treatment plant, and then it gets pumped back out into the river as effluent after it goes through our water treatment. The last thing that we're going to talk about that's not really great for the environment is something called fuel combustion, which is basically happening in industries and plants. And so you'll take a look there. Fossil fuels are formed from dead plants and animals, and we have a lot of fossil fuels here in Alberta. So they're called hydrocarbons because mostly they're made of hydrogen and carbon. I call the special kind of deal as CHO, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So a lot of things, a lot of gases, or a lot of organic material are made out of CHO. Anyway, so hydrocarbon here, it breaks up into carbon dioxide, which we know is not good for the environment, and into water, which actually too much water vapor in the environment isn't good either. It affects our climate. So coal produces the most CO2 and other harmful gases. So here in Alberta, we have to be careful to process that gas and to actually make it safe to put it back into the environment. We got methane and oxygen here, and so when we have that fuel combustion there, it releases CO2 gas, which we know is bad, and water, H2O, which actually isn't safe really as well. So sour gas, natural gas that contains hydrogen sulfide, is called sour or toxic. It's flammable, colorless gas that's toxic, and extremely low concentrations. It's heavier than air and may accumulate in low-lying areas. We as well have this problem with this hydrogen sulfide because we have this natural gas and a ton of it, and so there's going to be these signs that you're looking at right now, danger, lots of poisonous gas. So you don't want to be around there breathing that in. Natural gas producing plants in Alberta have to remove sulfur dioxide gas to lower emissions up to 99% removed, and then use it for fertilizers. Here's a flaring technique used to burn off that gas. You might have seen this before. You might have driven by this sort of stuff when you see like the flames burning. They're really just getting rid of harmful gases. Gas without hydrogen sulfide is called sweet gas. I want to talk a little bit about scrubbers, and this is basically the end of this lesson. Scrubbers are actually things on the very top of your industry pipes that release smoke into the atmosphere. Sulfur dioxide, anything dioxide is bad in the environment. So if you ever see any dioxide, and I'm asking you a question, what's a bad gas? Anything oxide is bad. sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, carbon dioxide, bad, 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 bad. Anything dioxide is just bad, okay? And so sulfur dioxide can be formed from burning coal and oil, which obviously we do in Alberta. So industries have to use scrubbers. That's what we call them. It kind of sounds funny, but they actually put this little piece on the very top of their nice little pipeline. And a scrubber is a system that uses and removes the harmful materials inside of the gas before it releases it into the environment out of the gas. So when you drive by all those pipelines and you think, man, that's a lot of pollution going to the atmosphere, it's actually not. They're using scrubbers on the very top of their industries to release gases that are 99% better than they were before. Sometimes they use things like limestone or certain types of rocks that actually kind of take out the bad stuff. There's other different chemicals that they use just to be able to release the gases that make it a lot safer. So it is super important to understand that that's what scrubbers are. So that's it for today. You need to obviously take this information. You're going to be doing a project for me on this sort of stuff. So you need to make sure that you understand all of the types of ways that things get into the environment, because that's what the main project is going to be. And so just make sure that you answer your definitions really thoroughly and that we start the process of doing this. Next time we're going to look at acids and bases, which is a concept that's going to be following you for a long time in high school. So thanks for joining me on environmental chemistry. Make sure you get outside today and check it out. You know what I'm saying? Peace out.